Hello, and welcome to Christ Lutheran Church's second video looking at confession. If you watched the previous video, then you know that confession has a lot to do with sin and what we do when we realize that we sin. This video will look at what happens inside us when we see our sin. Now, when we find out that we have committed some sin, often at first we are shocked. I did that? But of course, that feeling of shock doesn't stick around forever. Eventually the shock wears off and we are left feeling unsure about ourselves and about how things are going to end up for us. This is what it's like to hear words of law. We first feel shock, but then we also have feelings of uncertainty. We realize that we're not as great as we were acting like we were, and so it's like we are standing on shaky ground that we once thought was sturdy. We feel unsure. But then we get to remind ourselves of what Jesus did for us, going to the cross to die for our sins, to take away the guilt of our sins. In other words, we tell ourselves the gospel, the good news of forgiveness in God's Son. And it's this integral part, the good news, that brings us comfort and leaves us feeling content. When we are resting in God's love for us, then we are this wonderful mix of both humble and happy. So this is how confession often plays out inside our hearts. We are shocked by our sin. Then we feel unsure, needing help, and then the real help we need is what we remind ourselves of, forgiveness at the cross of Jesus. And the end result is we are content in this salvation. But sometimes when we find out about our sins, sure, the first thing that happens inside us may be shock, but it's not this kind of shock. It's this kind of shock. Instead of saying to ourselves, I did that, there are some times when we sin and it strikes us so much that we say to ourselves, I didn't think that I would ever do something that awful. Now, all sin is sin. Every sin is an offense to God. They all strike God the same. To God, all sins are a kind of rebellion against God. But some sins strike us stronger than other ones do. And so the shock is bigger. But not only is the shock sometimes bigger, those feelings of uncertainty that follow can be bigger too. We not only feel very shocked by certain sins we commit, we also feel very shaken by those sins. And that's a lot of things to feel. Those are some big feels. And who got us in that mess? We did. It's our own fault. It was our sin. But still, the feelings of shock and uncertainty can be so big that we can't get to the next part of this whole thing on our own. And that's when it's great to have someone else who can step in. Someone to tell you that good news that for you just seems so far away and so unlikely to be true right in that moment. That someone can tell you about the cross of Jesus and how the sin that you tell them about, that you are open about, that sin that shocks you and shakes you, they can tell you that your sin doesn't shock or shake God out of forgiving you through his Son. And in that way, the good news that you can't seem to remind yourself of comes from God through them. And that can lead you not just to this, but this. True, lasting comfort. This is the power of confession. And it can be so helpful to have this personal thing for you be something that a loved one helps you with. That's why in his small catechism, Martin Luther wrote, answering the question, what sins should we confess, by saying, before God, we should plead guilty of all sins, even those we are not aware of, as we do in the Lord's Prayer. But Martin Luther then followed that by saying, but before the pastor, we should confess only those sins which we know and feel in our hearts. And this doesn't have to be a pastor necessarily. It can be a Christian friend or family member. This is often how believers help, by being there and working through things, talking about the big stuff and always being ready to bring others to the hope that is so true, lasting, and comforting in our hearts. Here's your home activity. Read Acts chapter 2, verses 36 through 39. Here's some context for those verses. First, the where. This took place in Jerusalem, the city where Jesus lived. Then the when. This was just weeks after Jesus' death and resurrection. And then the what. In these verses, the Apostle Peter is finishing a talk to the city's people. And then here are the questions to ask. what sin did the people of Jerusalem learn they had been part of? And why is it good that Peter still spoke, answering their verse 37 question? That's all for this time. God bless.